Hello learners, welcome to the session on defense mechanisms, module 1. At the end of this module, you will be able to define defense mechanism, describe the conflict between the id, ego and superego, and list the common defense mechanisms. Have you ever heard the story of the fox and the grapes? Well, the fox tried hard to jump and eat the grapes. Since it couldn't, it walked off saying that the grapes are sour. Well, the fox has used one of the defense mechanisms. So what is this defense mechanism? Defense mechanism is a technique which an individual adopts to defend his anxieties and inadequacies in life. It is a sort of escapism from the realities for a short period of time. The idea of defense mechanism comes from the psychoanalytic theory, which was first proposed by Sigmund Freud. This theory brings in a psychological perspective of personality that sees personality as the interaction between three components, that is, id, ego, and superego. Now, let's see in brief about the id, ego, and superego. First, id. It represents the animal in man, that is, it has qualities of a spoiled child. It considers only the satisfaction of its needs because it is quite selfish and unethical, and it knows no reality and follows no rules. It operates according to the pleasure principle, that is, the drive to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. Its primary goal is to satisfy basic needs and drives. The next is superego. The superego is opposite to id. It represents the ethical and moral aspect of the psyche, that is, it houses all the rules that we have learned throughout our life and uses these to control the ego. It is also home to the expectations of the ego, the way we should behave and think. It is idealistic in nature because it avoids pleasure seeking and perfection is its only goal. Now let's see about ego. It operates rationally, that is, in a sensible manner. It is responsible for how we react in accordance with the needs of the external world. It acts as an intermediary between three sets of forces. First, the instinctive, that is, the innate or inborn behavior. The second, irrational demands of the id. And the third, realities of the external world and ethical, moral demands of the superego. It plays a balancing role to control id in terms of reality and to appease the superego because it delays satisfying its motives and channels behavior in a socially acceptable way. Let's understand this concept of id, ego, and superego with an example. As we already discussed, the id is impulsive and seeks pleasure. The superego is moralistic and acts as a conscience for good behavior. The impulsiveness, that is, the thoughtless nature of the id, and the moralistic nature of the superego are often in conflict. For example, you need to go outing with your friends, but you also feel a sense of responsibility as you need to appear for an important exam and you very well know that you need a good night's sleep. The ego, which is focused on the practical reality of situations, is constantly trying to manage the conflict between the id and the superego. This creates a lot of anxiety for the ego. Defense mechanisms or strategies that the ego uses to manage this anxiety that stems from the conflict between the id and the superego and the realities of daily life. It is a way to protect the ego from paralyzing anxiety. These defense mechanisms are at times not under a person's conscious control. In fact, most people use them without realizing it. Anna Freud says this as unconscious resources used by the ego. Now let me bring to light some of the common defense mechanisms. Sublimation, repression, regression, compensation, identification, displacement, rationalization, projection, withdrawal or seclusiveness, and sympathism. I hope you understood the meaning of defense mechanism and the concept of it, ego, and superego. We will see in detail about each of these defense mechanisms in the second and third modules. Thank you. Hello learners, welcome to the second module on defense mechanisms. In this module, you will be able to explain the various defense mechanisms, identify the usage of defense mechanisms among individuals, suggest measures to reduce overusage of defense mechanisms. First, let's see about sublimation. When an individual's conduct is met with an interference, that is, hindrance, it may be possible to resolve the resulting conflict by a substituted form of activity. Let us understand this with an example. An individual who has a lot of energy and aggression might become a sports person. This way, they can use their energy in a healthy way rather than letting it build up and cause problems. Basically, here the individual sublimates, that is, diverts his lower or negative urges towards higher or positive means. It is important to note that in the absence of suitable opportunities, there is a possibility of their energies being misdirected. Involving them in suitable activities will pave way to divert the energies in a positive manner. Next, let's see about repression. Repression is when an individual pushes memories or thoughts which could be a painful experience or unfulfilled wishes out of their minds, that is, unconscious mind, and forget about them. For example, a child who was abused represses the memories and becomes completely unaware of them as a young adult. But the repressed memories of abuse may still affect the individual's behavior by causing difficulty in forming relationships. Here, the individual gets temporary relief by pushing aside the painful experiences into the unconscious mind. It is vital to have a check on the flow of energy, like how the flow of water is checked by building a dam over it, but in case if the dam is weak, it may collapse. Similarly, the flow of energy should also be taken care, and too much of repression should always be avoided. Next, regression. It is an unconscious process of going backward or retreating to the past. Here, people seem to return to an earlier developmental stage. For example, an adolescent who is frustrated when his needs are not fulfilled may cry like a child, even though that's not how they typically respond or behave. Even in a classroom situation, a teacher uses this mechanism when they talk about their old experiences. But regression in its extreme form may affect the individual. It is important to find out the trigger and sort it at an earlier stage. Compensation. A process in which an individual tries to balance or make up his inabilities in one field by exhibiting his strength in another field. For example, a student who does not show satisfactory results in academic work may compensate this by excelling in co-curricular activities like games. Here, an individual basically tries to make up for the things that they are not good at by doing other things really well. The next is identification. Identification is when an individual takes on the characteristics of another person as a way to feel closer to them or to make themselves feel better. It is a sort of hero worshipping. For instance, an individual might start dressing like their favorite person because he wants to be like him, or they may also start copying the way they speak or behave. I hope you understand these defense mechanisms. Thank you. Welcome learners to this third module on defense mechanisms. At the end of the module, you will be able to explain the various defense mechanisms, identify the usage of defense mechanisms among individuals, and suggest measures to reduce the overusage of defense mechanisms. Now let's see about displacement. In the process of displacement, an individual redirects their feelings, like anger, towards someone or something else. For example, a student who is scolded by a teacher, when he is back home, he in turn redirects his anger towards the people in whom, that is his siblings or parents, or he may in turn break or throw things away. Next, a rationalization. Here, an individual justifies his failure by giving some excuses. Thus, he attempts to defend himself by inventing good reasons, that is, socially acceptable reasons to justify his behavior. For example, a student blames his teacher for the tough question paper or out-of-course questions for his failure, thereby trying to hide his weakness. This will lead to self-delusion, that is, the individual fails to recognize the reality. The next is projection. Through projection, an individual tries to see or attribute one's own inferior impulses in other persons or objects. That is, it involves taking your own thoughts, feelings, desires, etc., and putting them onto someone else. For instance, if someone feels angry all the time, then they might start thinking that everyone else is just as angry as they are. Thus, they overlook their shortcomings by assuring that others are even worse. The next is withdrawal or seclusiveness. In this mechanism, an individual tends to withdraw himself from the situation that causes failure or frustration. He safeguards himself by running away from difficult situations. For example, a child fearing possible failure may refuse participation in games and thus deceives himself by believing that he could do well if he had participated. This behavior, in long term, may make an individual timid and weak in facing real life situations. The next is sympathism. Through sympathism, individuals exaggerate their difficulties and try to evoke sympathy of others for their own failures and inadequacies. For instance, a student who is not working hard may evoke sympathy of his classmates by telling that he remains busy in attending his father, who is seriously ill, and therefore he could not concentrate on his work. I hope you understood about the various defense mechanisms. Now, next time when you see someone uses these defense mechanisms, you'll be able to identify them. Thank you. Hello learners, welcome to this session on Defense Mechanisms, Module 4. I hope now you know what is defense mechanism, the concept of id, ego and superego, and some of the common defense mechanisms. In this module, we will see about the situations in which the defense mechanisms are often used. At the end of this module, you will be able to recognize the situations where the defense mechanisms are often used. Let us see them one by one. First, to avoid difficult situation. People use defense mechanisms when they don't want to deal with a difficult situation. For example, if someone asks why they are sad and upset, then they may try and change the subject or say that everything is okay even though it isn't. Next, to fit within a group. People use defense mechanisms when they want to fit in within a group or to act in a way that is more socially acceptable. For example, an individual might say that they like the same music as their friends, even though they don't really care about it. Next, to put on a brave face. Defense mechanisms come in handy when an individual needs to put on a brave face for other people. For example, If their loved one dies, then they act strong in front of their near ones, as they need someone who need to be strong for them. Next, to build self-esteem. People use it to build their self-esteem. So if someone has a problem, they stop themselves from thinking about the problem by focusing on other things instead. It is important to note that defense mechanisms tend not to change the root problem. They do not solve problems, but only delay them. Next, to cope with stressful situations. Defense mechanisms can also be used by people when they are in stressful situations. When people are under pressure, they use it to manage the stress they feel in times of high anxiety. They may not think about issues that make them anxious or redirect their feelings towards someone or something else. Next, to manage anxiety. People use to reduce their anxiety by managing the feelings of fear and worry associated with it. So they don't feel quite so scary. They try to think of reasons why this particular situation isn't actually dangerous. To protect from difficult emotions. People use defense mechanisms when they want to protect or control themselves from difficult emotions. For example, they might resort to repression, where memories or thoughts are pushed out of their mind. This could be helpful for some period of time. However, if these memories come back later, then they can cause a lot of distress. Let's observe what Morgan says about defense mechanisms. They merely conceal or disguise the real problem. It is still there, ready to produce anxiety again and again. Therefore, care should be taken that our children do not use these defense mechanisms frequently in their day-to-day life. I would like to conclude with a proverb which says, "Too much of anything is good for nothing." Similarly, excessive use of defense mechanisms will cause more anxiety and stress. Therefore, it should be used with caution and within limits. Thank you.